José Mourinho is a man who needs no introduction. He's one of the most successful managers of all time, a 2-time Champions League winner, a 4-time winner of world's best club coach. He has multiple league titles across different countries, and he's also the first manager to win all 3 of the active European competitions, the Champions League, the Europa League and the Conference League, 4 if you count the UEFA Super Cup. Mourinho's rise has been one of legend, one that is almost video game-like, with his football philosophy inspiring hundreds of future coaches. His accolades with Chelsea, Inter Milan, Real Madrid and even later down the line with Manchester United and Roma are stuff of legend. But his most famous trophy win is arguably with FC Porto in 2004, where not only did he win the league, he also had one of the greatest underdog stories of all time, where they won the Champions League. But not many people know, the season before that, he did the exact same with the Europa League, but this time winning a Taça de Portugal as well, completing a historic treble. But it always hasn't been smooth sailing for Jose. Not a stranger to controversy, he has been embroiled in some scandals over the years, and even some before taking over FC Porto. In this video, we take a look at how Jose Mourinho led FC Porto to Champions League triumph in 2004 and how the special one was once the unknown one. But before we take a look at Jose the manager, we have to rewind to the very beginning. José Mario dos Santos Mourinho Felix was born in Setúbal, Portugal on the 26th of January 1963 to a primary school teacher mother, Maria, and a retired professional footballer father, José Manuel Mourinho Felix, or as he was more commonly known, Felix Mourinho. His father played professionally as a goalkeeper for clubs like Belenenses and Vitória de Setúbal, earning 1 cap for Portugal on the course of his career. But away from football, José's great uncle, Mario Ledo, was one of the Portugal top sardine suppliers, with businesses in Setúbal, Porto and the Algarve. He became very wealthy during the Salazar regime, which promoted patriotism and self-sufficiency. In fact, Ledo was one of the richest men in Setúbal, and even paid for the land and construction of the Estadio Bonfim, Vitória Setúbal Stadium in 1962. At a time when footballers didn't earn huge wages, the financial support from Ledo was a big help to the Mourinho family. However, after Ledo's death in 1972 and the 1974 Carnation Revolution, which brought down Salazar's Estado Novo regime, things changed dramatically for the Mourinhos. The revolutions opened up new idea for Jose, but it was a tough time for his family. Ledo's business was taken over by the state and the family lost nearly all their properties, only keeping one in nearby Palema. His father, Felix, even considered moving to a club in Spain. The political and economic upheaval made the future feel very uncertain for the family. Personality-wise, the classroom played a big role in shaping Mourinho, which wasn't surprising considering his mother, Maria, had him go to a private school. School quickly brought out Mourinho's perfectionist side. By the time he was 5, he kept all his pencils, rulers, crayons and school books all neatly organised in his bag, which might not seem like much, but for a 5-year-old, it's very rare to show strong signs of leadership and organisation at that age. But of course, Mourinho's real love was football. Despite often being away with Vitória and later Belenenses, it was his father, Felix, who had the biggest influence on Mourinho. From a very young age, Mourinho absorbed everything about football from his father. By the age of 4, Mourinho was already involved, acting as a ball boy behind his dad's goal during Vitória training sessions. Felix believed his son could follow in his footsteps and carry on the family name in Portuguese football. He taught Mourinho the importance of understanding the national game. But after the fall of Salazar, as Western culture began to pour into Portugal, Mourinho developed a love for English football. He became a Liverpool fan and idolised stars like Kevin Keegan and Kenny Dalglish. All of this happened around the same time Felix Mourinho earned his only 1 cap for Portugal, at 34 years old in 1972 in a match against Ireland during the Independence Cup. Although Mourinho loved playing football, it was clear that he was not going to reach the level that his father did. But Felix found other ways to involve young Jose. Mourinho began travelling with Felix on his away trips. Just as Felix's playing career was winding down, he would also get into coaching. He had his first job with Estrela Porto Alegre in 1976 and then with Rio Ave in 1981. It was all natural for him to get young Jose involved. Felix would teach Mourinho tactics and the basics of coaching. But when Jose got older, his father gave him some more challenges to see if he could adapt in an off-the-field role in football. You see, his father was actually the manager of Rio Ave in 1981, and Jose was actually a player in his father's own team. And you might think, well, surely he's just going to play Jose all the time, right? Well, not really. In fact, instead of using the young Jose as a player, he made a then 19-year-old Jose Mourinho do things such as lead the under-16s team, writing scouting reports on opposition players, and even passing messages to the players on the pitch at the time. With Felix Mourinho as the main man and Jose helping out in the background, Rio Ave's season was an outright success, and the club achieved a highest ever 5th place finish, which is still the highest the club has ever reached till this day. And Felix and Jose became popular figures in the dressing room. This was due to his easygoing personality and also due to the fact they felt Felix did not show any nepotism to Jose Mourinho. However, the Rio Ave president at the time, Jose Maria Pinho, did not agree and believed Jose was taking advantage of his nepotism. And although the season was already wrapped up, he blocked Jose Mourinho from playing in the final match of the season against the title winners that season, Sporting Club de Portugal. But you could argue that Jose got the last laugh though, as Rio Ave lost 7-0. And the incident actually played a big role in Felix Mourinho's decision to quit Rio Ave that summer. Mourinho would follow his father to Belenenses, but he would go as a registered player. But again, it was his behind the scenes contributions that stood out. This would become a pattern of his playing career. Over 7 seasons with Rio Ave, Belenenses, Sesimbra and Comercio y Industria. Ironically, while his playing days seemed stuck in the lower divisions, it was during this time that he had some of his most formative experience. At Sesimbra, a 3rd division club, Mourinho emerged as one of the team's leaders, but the team faced major issues off the pitch, including unpaid wages and internal problems, which held them back for many years. These struggles meant Mourinho never had the breakthrough season he might have hoped in those early key years between 1983 and 1985. But Jose Mourinho thrived in amateur football when he played for his final club, Comercio y Industria, in Setubal's Division 1. Even though he didn't get paid and had to buy his own gear, Mourinho loved the freedom that came with playing amateur football. Mourinho quickly became a fan favourite at Industria, but not for being a player, not even for being a manager. He had an unlikely act of heroism that still many remember to this day. After a training session, Mourinho and his teammate, known as De, were the last ones in the changing rooms. De headed to the car park to drive home in his old Fiat, which was more than 10 years old, but as he started the engine, it caught fire. In panic, he hit his head and couldn't open the driver's door. The passenger side was also blocked by a wall. He was trapped. And as the flames grew and De screamed for help, Mourinho came running from the dressing room and pulled him to safety. If there was ever a moment that showed Mourinho's loyalty, courage and resilience, it was then. A team-first attitude which he would later demand from all his players that played under him. It was during the time as a youngster and a player, Mourinho would start taking some coaching courses held by the English and Scottish FA, and even took a part-time job as a physical education teacher. In the early 1990s, Mourinho began his professional journey into management in his hometown, Vitória de Setúbal, where he became a youth team coach. He later took a job as an assistant manager at Estrela da Amadora and then worked as a scout for Orenense. However, in 1992, a major opportunity came his way, arguably the biggest and most decisive moment of Jose Mourinho's entire career. In 1992, Sir Bobby Robson was appointed manager of Sporting Club de Portugal, and of course, being from England, had no knowledge of the Portuguese language. So he would need someone who could translate things to him, to the squad, to the management, and to the fans. he needed an interpreter. And on the 7th of July, José Mourinho was appointed that man, who was officially introduced alongside Robson by President Sousa Sintra. Although initially José's role was just to be an interpreter or a translator, Robson was actually very impressed with how Mourinho's tactical understanding of Portuguese football was. He believed that José had a deep understanding of the game and sometimes would speak to José for hours about different tactical schemes and football in general, especially regarding football philosophies. Sir Bobby Robson soon began to trust Mourinho explicitly. He used Mourinho more as an assistant. He relied on the young coach's insight to plan for upcoming matches, especially against Portuguese opposition. A quote from Bobby Robson back in 2005 would say the following, quote, "He'd come back and hand me a dossier that was absolutely first class. They were as good as anything I'd ever received. Here he was in his early 30s, never been a player or a coach to speak of, giving me reports as good as anything as I ever got." End quote. After a decent but non-spectacular third place finish with Sporting in 1993, Bobby Robson was then fired in December of that same year. The final straw being a loss to Casino Salzburg in the UEFA Cup, now known as the Europa League. The club president, Sousa Sintra, who Bobby Robson would later call a loose cannon, made the decision to sack him, even though at the time Sporting were first place in the league, and it was also the first time that Robson had ever been sacked as manager. And as a Sporting fan, I could say even later down the line, Sousa Sintra would make some baffling decisions, but this one probably the most baffling of them all. But soon after though, Sir Bobby Robson got his own back. He took a job with rivals Porto, and brought of course a young Mourinho as his assistant. It should be noted that Robson also gave a chance to another young man, a man who lived in the same apartment complex of him, a man by the name of André Villas-Boas. But that is a video for another time. Sir Bobby and Mourinho had great success at Porto. In the 93-94 season, they reached the Champions League semi-finals, but were stopped by Johan Cruyff's Barcelona. They also won the Portuguese league titles in 1995 and 1996. Together, they built an exciting attacking team with talented forwards like Julovic, Domingos and Rui Barros. Because of this success, Bobby Robson was actually picked as the successor to Johan Cruyff's Barcelona when he left in 1996. This was no easy feat though, as Johan Cruyff was not only a club legend as a player, but also as a manager. Cruyff had led Barcelona to their first ever European Cup in 1992 and won 4 straight league titles from 1991 to 1994. Sir Bobby would also take Mourinho with him to Barcelona. The dynamic duo would not have any problems following Johan Cruyff, as Barcelona went on to complete a treble, winning the Copa del Rey along with the Cup Winners' Cup and also the Spanish Super Cup. But when Mourinho had to pass instructions from the players from Bobby Robson, some English-speaking members of the squad would add that José Mourinho would add his own tactical flair to some of these instructions, often explaining things in more detail than Bobby Robson did. However, this would be Robson's last season as the club manager, as he left after just 1 year at the Camp Nou. Instead, Robson still took a role in football. At Barcelona, he was promoted to the general manager, while Barcelona went in an exciting direction and hired young Dutch coach Louis van Gaal, and he kept Mourinho on as an assistant. Over the previous season, Mourinho's influence had grown over the Barcelona first squad. He was already fluent in Spanish, and he kept translating for Louis van Gaal and Sir Bobby Robson, especially during press conferences. Little by little, both Robson and Louis van Gaal gave more to José Mourinho. In Louis van Gaal's first 2 seasons at Barcelona, the club won back-to-back La Liga titles. Like Robson, Van Gaal gave Mourinho a lot of responsibility. Known for being strict and detail-orientated, Van Gaal may have seen a younger version of himself in young José Mourinho. Years later, Van Gaal would describe him as saying, quote, "He was an arrogant young man who didn't always respect authority, but I also liked that about him. He wasn't afraid to challenge me when I was wrong. In the end, I listened to him more than I listened to any of my other assistants." End quote. Despite early success, Van Gaal was actually sacked in the year 2000. The main reason was his failure to win the Champions League during Barcelona's centenary year. The club had hoped to lift their second European Cup in 1999, especially with the final being held at the Camp Nou, but they didn't even make it out the group stage, finishing behind Manchester United and Bayern Munich, who went on to contest the final. José Mourinho also left Barcelona around the same time. Reportedly, he was frustrated that the club's president, Josep Luis Núñez, kept calling him and referring to him as the interpreter, a label that the Catalan media picked up on. After years of learning under top managers, Mourinho felt his apprenticeship was complete. He was ready to step out of the shadows and take control of his own team. It was time he became a manager in his own right. Think, despite being a successful assistant, that Jose Mourinho would have to work his way up, either in divisions of Spain, England, Italy, or even Portugal? Well, not exactly. Jose Mourinho, being the ambitious one, jumped in the deep end. The chance to become a top-tier manager arrived in September 2000, where he was appointed the manager of Benfica. Mourinho was appointed the replacement for Benfica manager Jupp Heynckes after the 4th week of the league season. Benfica, of course, are one of the grandest names in European football, winning the Champions League twice with Bela Gutmann. But unfortunately for Mourinho, politics led a big part in his actual arrival and would hinder him from day one. When Mourinho took over at Benfica, the Benfica board wanted him to hire an assistant manager by the name of Josualdo Ferreira, but Mourinho refused. He wanted his own hand-picked assistant, much like Bobby Robson and Louis van Gaal did for him. So he chose Carlos Moser, a former Benfica defender, to be his right-hand man instead. Mourinho had known Josualdo Ferreira from his time as a student and wasn't impressed by him in the slightest. Just a few weeks at Benfica, Mourinho received a surprising phone call. This from Bobby Robson, who had recently become the new manager of Newcastle. He wanted Mourinho to be his assistant one more time, promising that when he retires, he would give the job of first-team coach to Jose Mourinho. But Mourinho turned it down. He believed Robson, who was now in his 70s and was managing his boyhood club in Newcastle, would struggle to give control up if that day ever came, and Mourinho wanted to make it on his own as the manager and was also at a big club at Benfica. Mourinho and his assistant Carlos Moser quickly became a popular duo at Benfica, highlighted by a 3-0 win over rival Sporting in December. But their time at the club soon came under threat when Benfica held presidential elections. They had elected a new president, Manuel Villarino, and as part of his campaign, he promised to replace Jose Mourinho with former Benfica player Toné. Although Villarino did not plan to sack Jose Mourinho right away, Mourinho saw the writing on the wall, and he went to the new president demanding a contract extension. When Villarino refused, Mourinho took a very bold decision. He resigned on the spot after beating Sporting 3-0, just after 9 league games in charge. In a later interview, Villarino admitted he had made a mistake and later expressed regret over losing Mourinho. But the story would not end there, ladies and gentlemen. I just mentioned how Sporting lost 3-0 to a Jose Mourinho-led Benfica. Well, that was the final straw for club president Antonio Dias de Cunha, who sacked Sporting manager Augusto Inacio, despite winning the league the previous season. And the Sporting president had a master plan. He would sign the young coach who was at Sporting where he started his pretty much manager career, assistant manager career anyway, and it would surely be a full circle moment. So surely no one would say no to this brilliant master plan. Well, this is where the Sporting fans come in. The Sporting fans, usually being their own worst enemy, and especially in this case, were outraged. They did not like how Mourinho made some controversial and arrogant gestures towards Sporting when he was beating them 3-0 just a few days before. And Sporting fans did not want someone who disrespected the club in such nature to manage their team. Following day, during a press conference where the president was going to get rid of Augusto Inacio and also announced Jose Mourinho, Sporting fans actually stormed in the press conference room. They demanded that Jose Mourinho would not be hired, and they also said there would be serious consequences if the club went ahead with the appointment. Faced with the backlash, Sporting eventually backed out of the deal, and Jose Mourinho was not going to be able to coach Sporting, which is arguably one of the biggest butterfly effects in footballing history. He would spend the rest of the season out of work until he joined then mid-table club União de Leiria. in July 2001. The team had finished 5th the season before under manager Manuel Jose, but he would leave for the wealthier Al Ahly FC in Egypt. Leleye had some decent players at their disposal, such as Nuno Valente, Darley and future Wolves player Silas. This is where Mourinho finally had a squad he could mould into his own image, without any interference from upstairs or from any other manager. With Mourinho's influence, Leleye transformed into a well-drilled, resolute and highly organised unit. A difficult team to break down, these would be traits that José Mourinho would bring with him to every club since. After a 1-1 draw against Santa Clara on the 20th of January 2002, Mourinho had led União de Leleye into an 8-match unbeaten run in the Primeira Liga, consisting of 6 wins and 2 draws, dating back to the 25th of November 2001. At that place, Leleye sat in 4th place in the league table, 1 point ahead of Porto, 1 point behind Benfica and 6 points off the top. Mourinho's impressive performances with Leleye did not go unnoticed, catching the attention of Portugal's biggest clubs. And what would come next would be a decision that Benfica and Sporting both let happen, but would later come to regret. José Mourinho would resign and step down as manager of União de Leleye in January 2002. Why would he do that? He was hand chosen by Pinto da Costa, the president of FC Porto, to become the new Porto manager. Now I could easily end the video off there saying, and the rest is history. But José Mourinho didn't walk in and transform them overnight. It was a much longer and more detailed story. You see, at the time of the appointment, Porto were actually in 5th place. As mentioned earlier, Leleye were ahead of them, but also were Sporting, Benfica and Boa Vista. They'd also been knocked out of the Taça de Portugal, which is the Portuguese equivalent to the FA Cup, and they also finished dead last in the UEFA Champions League group that season. In Mourinho's first game in charge, he would face Marítimo, and he would beat them 2-1, with notable players in the Porto lineup such as Victor Bahia, Jorge Andrade, Ricardo Costa, Helder Postiga, and many more. Porto would pick up instantly under Mourinho, and he went on a 4-game win streak, including beating Benfica, his former club, 3-2 along the way. And overall that season for Porto, in all competitions, Mourinho would win 12 games, draw 2 and lose 5. It must be said that 2 of those losses came against a Real Madrid team consisting of the likes of Iker Casillas, Roberto Carlos, Fernando Hierro, Steve McManaman, Zidane, Ronaldo and Raul. But both games were only lost by 1 goal. Despite the difficult circumstances, Mourinho, ever as confident as he was, made a promise on the last game of the season to the Porto fans. Quote, "I will make Porto champions next year." End quote. No pressure, Jose. The summer of 2002 is arguably one of Porto's best transfer windows, not just at the time, but also in recent memory. In came future coach Nuno Espírito Santo, Paulo Ferreira, Maniche, and also from União de Leleye, Mourinho's former club, Nuno Valente and Darley. Despite drawing the first game of the season to Belenenses, Mourinho created a solid spine for FC Porto's team. A spine consisting of in goal Victor Bahia, Ricardo Carvalho and Ricardo Costa as the defence, and players like Costinha, Deco. Another signing that Jose made, which is arguably one of the best of his career and an absolute coup, was Maniche, a free transfer from Benfica, who also played a pivotal part in fact, in the Porto sides to come, but especially this year. And it showed. FC Porto went unbeaten in the league until February 15th, where they won 18 matches, including a 2-1 win over Benfica, a 1-0 away win over Sporting, the winners of the league last year by the way. The first loss came at the hands of Marítimo in a 2-1 loss. However, they would go on to win the next 6 matches, including another win against Benfica, and had the league title wrapped up by April, finishing 11 points clear of second place and former club Benfica, and 27 points ahead of the team that rejected him, Sporting. But it wasn't just in the league where they had success. They stormed the Taça de Portugal, winning every single game, including a 7-0 rout of Varzim in the quarterfinals, and Mourinho would stab the dagger in the hearts of his former club Ria, beating them 1-0 in the final. And of course, the goal scorer and the only goal of that game coming from former player Dragao. But is the UEFA Cup, which is now known as the Europa League, Mourinho would announce himself on the world stage with some absolutely dominating results, beating Warsaw 6-2 on aggregate in the first round, a 3-0 win on aggregate against Austria Vienna, a 3-0 win against Lens in the third round, an 8-3 demolition of Denizlispor in the fourth round. But the real big result would come in the quarter-final, in a game that would not come easy against a very good Panathinaikos team featuring some future Euro winners just a year later. They would need extra time, where Dragao would score the winner in the 103rd minute, sending Porto to the semi-finals of the competition, where they demolished Lazio 4-1 on aggregate, which led them to the final against a good Celtic team who had another young manager on the other side and an up-and-coming manager in Martin O'Neill. And that Celtic teams featured the likes of names like Stilian Petrov and of course the Swedish sensation Henrik Larsson. But Porto were against the odds even more than you might think. You see, UEFA actually expected 4,000 Celtic fans to travel where the final was being held. The match actually took place on a Wednesday, so many people thought it would be even less than 4,000 coming over. What happened next was absolutely incredible, as 80,000 Celtic fans came from Scotland to support their club Celtic, in what was the largest travelling support for a major European final. But enough about Celtic. Porto's team was absolutely stacked, featuring the likes of Victor Bailly, George Costa, Ricardo Carvalho, Maniche, Deco and Dragao all starting. Dragao would open the scoring for Porto, but the Swede Henrik Larsson would equalise soon after. Dmitry Anelchev put Porto up again, only for Henrik Larsson to score one more time. But the ever reliable big game Dragao, someone who helped Mourinho so much at União but now at Porto, would eventually get the winner in the 115th minute, cementing José Mourinho's FC Porto on the big stage and completing a historic treble. Porto fans were amazed and the board were thrilled. But of course there was always the question of next year. And asked after the game by commentators, Mourinho would say the following, quote, "I think we can do some nice things in the Champions League, but I don't think we can win it. Only the Sharks who can afford to spend 20, 30 or even 40 million euros on one player can do that." End quote. Instead of being one of those teams that spent 20, 30 or 40 on a player, Mourinho conducted some very good business at FC Porto. Mourinho spent less than 10 million euros on signings of Benny McCarthy, Carlos Alberto, Bozingua, Sergio Conceição, who would be a future Porto manager, and Pedro Mendes. He also managed to keep the core of the team, as they believed in the manager and they had a great squad mentality. The only departure of note was Helder Postiga to Spurs for 9 million euros. But it wasn't only his players that were rejecting offers. José Mourinho actually had a job offer from Paris Saint-Germain, but he had no intention of jumping ship while he was doing so well with Porto. Mourinho was a magnet to silverware in Portugal. In the first game of the season, the Supertaça, where the winners of the Taça de Portugal would face the winners of the league, or in this case, the runners-up of the Taça de Portugal would face the league champions in Porto, Porto would once again beat União de Leiria, where they beat them 1-0. However, it wasn't all smiles for Jose, because a few days after they had to play in the UEFA Super Cup. Unfortunately, against one of the best AC Milan teams in the history of the sport. They unfortunately lost 1-0 to a team who of course would be favourites for the Champions League that year, with the squad with the likes of Dida, Nesta, Maldini, Rui Costa, Gattuso, Pirlo, Seedorf, Shevchenko and Inzaghi, with even Cafu and Rivaldo coming off the bench in that game. But one loss was not enough to faze Mourinho or FC Porto, as they went to go unbeaten again domestically until the 3rd of April, winning 23 games in the league, including a 4-1 hammering against Sporting and a 2-0 win against Benfica. They drew 5 games, but they would only lose 2 games in the league that season, one to Gil Vicente 2-0 and another to Rio Ave 1-0, but still ran away with the league with 8 points clear ahead of Benfica and 9 ahead of Sporting. Unfortunately, the Taça de Portugal would not be on the cards for Mourinho and FC Porto, as they, despite being 1-0 up at half time, would lose 2-1 in extra time thanks to a Benfica Simão 104th minute winner. But on to the Champions League. They were not dealt any favours in their group. They would be drawn against Real Madrid, or that time Galactico Madrid, is if you look at some of their players, you've got David Beckham, Figo, Zidane, Roberto Carlos, Makelele, Raul, Ronaldo and Morientes, just to name a few. They were also drawn against Marseille, who had Drogba, Flamini and Daniel Valbuiten, and Partizan, who had, well, former Sporting player Simon Vukovic and Taribo West. What might shock you is that FC Porto got off to an awful start. They drew the first game against Partizan and lost the second game to Real Madrid. But luckily Mourinho was able to turn it around. They would win the next 3 games, which put them through a second place in their group, with Marseille only getting 4 points and Partizan only getting 3. However, UEFA would not be kind to Mourinho or Porto again, as they were drawn against Sir Alex's Manchester United, which featured the likes of Rio Ferdinand, Gary Neville, Roy Keane, Paul Scholes, Darren Fletcher, Ryan Giggs, a young Cristiano Ronaldo, Luis Zaha, Ruud van Nistelrooy and Ole Gunnar Solskjaer. And it would get even worse for Mourinho when Quinton Fortune gave Manchester United an early lead at Porto's Estadio de Dragao. And in this case, it was the experienced Alex Ferguson versus a somewhat inexperienced José Mourinho, at manager level anyway. And it seemed that Sir Alex was going to take the win here. But Mourinho's Porto, so often as they have done under his leadership, dug in and found fresh reserves of resilience. New signing Benny McCarthy would score the equaliser, but just soon after he would score again as Porto would win 2-1 against Manchester United, in which they would have an advantage to take back to Old Trafford, but should be wary of that one away goal that Manchester United would score. It was a result that stunned the footballing world, and many thought Mourinho could overcome the odds, but like I mentioned, with that away goal and United's firepower, it wouldn't come easy. The second leg was played in a 67,000 raucous crowd at Old Trafford, but this match would become a defining moment in Jose Mourinho's career. He was doubted, people were sceptical of him and his Porto side. He crafted one of the best chapters in football history. When the world doubted him, the Portuguese tactician delivered a miracle. Paul Scholes would open the scoring after 32 minutes, giving Manchester United the edge on away goals. He would again score, but the goal was controversially ruled for offside. But time kept ticking away, and the minutes were becoming seconds. The score remained 1-0, and Porto looked destined to fall short. But then in the dying moments of the match, the unthinkable happened. In the 91st minute, Benny McCarthy stood over a free kick. This was Porto's final chance to salvage their European dream. His powerful strike forced Tim Howard not to catch it, and he actually fumbled the ball in the area. And for a fleeting moment, time felt like it had frozen. Someone who didn't freeze was Costinha. In the 6-yard box, he tapped it in and gave Porto the advantage and what seemed like the win with so many seconds to go. Old Trafford was stunned into silence, but one person who was not stunned in anything was Jose Mourinho. Porto had done the unthinkable. From the brink of despair, they had triumphed. Goliath had fallen. The Porto players couldn't believe it themselves, as it seemed like they all collapsed on the pitch, pouring out tears and shouts of disbelief. And then, of course, Mourinho sprinting down the touchline, fist pumping, arms flailing, a wild, unfiltered outburst of emotion that etched itself into football history. On the world's biggest stage in one of the sport's greatest arenas, the star was born. Mourinho's team had come out against one of the true giants of the game, and Mourinho would say, quote, "My team were out after 90 minutes, and in the quarterfinals after 91, end quote. But Mourinho was not satisfied there. They just beaten Manchester United, and it really felt like they could go on and do anything. Porto weren't just here to compete, they were here to take over. They would embarrass Lyon in the next 2 legs, with an aggregate of 4-2. Then would come the semi-final, something that isn't as memorable I suppose as the Man United win, but something that is just so Jose Mourinho. This was one of his best tactical battles yet, as they faced Deportivo La Coruña in the semi-final. Stunning victories over Manchester United and Lyon were great, but the prize was so much greater in this game, as the winner would go on to the final of the biggest competition in football. His unity in the squad played a massive part in these 2 games. They had a plan with an end goal in mind, and that was to neutralise Deportivo La Coruña. And as many saw the first game as a 0-0, a very boring game, It all was a part of José Mourinho's master plan, and they would go to Deportivo's own ground with all to play for. Where some other managers might get a bit blinded by the lights, Mourinho was still grounded as ever. He had a tactical plan and he was going to execute it. But Deportivo were no slouches either. They had dismantled one of the favourites for the competition, AC Milan, in the leg previous. But Mourinho trusted his own system. The biggest tactical play was for Costinha to follow Juan Carlos Valerón like a shadow and constantly man-mark him. This would choke off Deportivo's creativity and not allow them to create any chances and in turn get any goals. Just past the hour mark, Deco was brought down in the box. Derlei stepped up and converted the penalty, getting a vital away goal for Porto. A textbook Mourinho smash and grab. Cold, calculated, but also efficient. Mourinho had Deportivo exactly where he wanted them, scrambling for answers and needing 2 goals due to the away goals rule. But Porto had such a strong spine with the midfield and the defence that Deportivo were unable to break them down. Porto held their own and held their ground, executing Mourinho's plan to perfection, and they had booked their place in the Champions League final. Mourinho's vision, which was once considered idealistic, had become a stunning reality. Meanwhile, Monaco had produced a surprise of their own by toppling Chelsea in the other semi-final, setting the stage for an unexpected showdown in Germany. Under the guidance of Didier Deschamps, the French side had developed into an energetic, fearless team, featuring rising stars like Patrice Evra and a red-hot Fernando Morientes. But the heartbeat of the side was Ludovic Giuly, the small playmaker who dictated tempo and inspired movement, a player who would conjure danger even when seemingly idle. But however, Monaco's star man was dealing with injury in the lead-up, but he was cleared to start the final. For the opening exchanges, he drifted between the lines with typical invention. His presence alone was a source of unease for Porto, but unfortunately for him, just 22 minutes in, disaster struck. A blow to his midsection forced him off. And with his departure, Monaco's rhythm fractured. The game, and perhaps the trophy, shifted in Porto's favour. This gave Porto more license to push forward. Just 6 minutes before the break, Carlos Alberto would find a sliver of space in the box and lash the ball into the top corner, giving Porto a 1-0 lead. With 73 minutes on the clock and the game beginning to unravel, Porto found themselves on a dangerous 3-on-3 break. The ball was pulled back to Deco. With the calm of a man composing a masterpiece, wrong-footed the keeper Flavio Roma with a sublime finish, the kind that only an inspired genius, a little magician like Deco, could be able to pull off. Just 4 minutes later, the coup de grace had arrived. Alinchev had broke free into acres of space as Monaco at this point were just chasing shadows. They were caught high up on the pitch and a lofted pass dropped perfectly into his path, and without hesitation he hammered the ball into the roof of the net. It was emphatic, poetic and a thunderous exclamation mark at the end of a brilliant performance. When the final whistle blew, it triggered an eruption of celebration. On the pitch, jubilation reigned, but Mourinho, for once, was subdued. He kissed the gleaming trophy and raised it to the sky. Yet, there was composed stillness about him, the calm of a man who just completed a mission. The grind, the obsession, the relentless pursuit of perfection was complete. All of it had led to this. The job was done. He had nothing left to prove at FC Porto. A man who was binned off Benfica, chased out of Sporting by his own supporters, labelled as just an interpreter by FC Barcelona, had shocked the world stage, but he did so with tactical brilliance and a unity of a squad that loved him. And he remains still not just an FC Porto legend, but a legend of the sport. This is how the unknown one became the special one. Thank you very much for watching this video. I really enjoyed making it. I know a lot of you love my timeline about Ruben Amorim, how he went from no one to becoming, a sporting legend almost. So I thought I'd do the same with sort of the originator of that and José Mourinho. Even though he did so much for Porto, as a sporting fan and someone being, brought up in a Portuguese household, there is just utmost respect for José Mourinho. What a manager. And just crazy sort of the butterfly effects you have from like Barcelona or from Sporting, first sacking Bobby Robson and then changing their mind due to fan pressure just incredible. That led to one of the biggest butterfly effects. Who knows if, let's say, Mourinho goes to Sporting, if Porto become a great side, if Mourinho becomes a great coach, what if he failed at Sporting? He might not have ever got that chance at Porto. Maybe he doesn't get Chelsea, Inter, Real Madrid, etc. It's all up in the air, but it's fun to think about. But I hope you did enjoy this video. Let me know what other timeline videos you want next. In my head, I've got the Alkshire attacks up next because it's something I know a bit more about, and it's something that I could provide a bit of fan insight to as well. But let me know if you want to see something Portuguese football related, or even not. Let me know in the comments down below. I've been Samuel Seca. This has been how the unknown one became the special one. I will see you next time, and peace.